I always believed family came first. For as long as I could remember, I had taken care of my younger brother, Scott. Our parents weren't exactly model citizens. They had their own demons, and I'd stepped into the role of protector early on. Scott was always the sensitive one, the dreamer. I was the rock, the one who made sure he had a roof over his head and a chance to find his way. When I married Anna, I was proud to introduce her to Scott. She was beautiful, sharp, and full of charm. Scott adored her immediately, though I thought it was just admiration. He'd always looked up to me, and it seemed natural he'd be drawn to the woman I chose to spend my life with. Life carried on, as it does. Scott struggled to keep a steady job, bouncing between gigs and passions. He often stayed with us during his low points, and I was fine with it. He was my brother after all, and had always been supportive, or so I thought. She'd often tell me she was helping Scott through his rough patches, counseling him when I wasn't around. "You're such a good big brother," Anna would say, running her fingers through my hair. "He's lucky to have you." That's why, when Anna started spending more time with Scott, taking him to therapy appointments, encouraging him to join her on her morning runs, I didn't think much of it. She told me Scott was battling depression, and he needed someone who understood him. I worked long hours at the firm, so I was grateful she cared enough to help. It wasn't until later that I realized she was helping herself to something else entirely. It started with little things, a lingering glance between them that felt off, a laugh that came too easily. When Scott would come over, they'd often retreat to the kitchen together, their voices hushed and intimate. Anna waved it off every time I asked. "He's fragile, Brian," she'd say, her tone laced with irritation. "Don't make him feel uncomfortable. He needs support, not suspicion." I told myself I was overthinking it. Why would Anna cheat on me with my own brother? It was absurd, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. One evening, after dinner, Anna was texting someone while we sat on the couch. She tilted the screen away when I glanced over. "Who's that?" I asked casually. "Nicole," she replied without missing a beat. Nicole was her best friend, the perpetual excuse for late nights out and secretive phone calls. "She's venting about her breakup again." I nodded, letting it go. But that night, as Anna slept beside me, I couldn't resist the pull of her phone. I unlocked it using her predictable code, our wedding anniversary, and scrolled through her messages. My heart stopped when I saw Scott's name at the top of the list. The messages weren't explicit, but they were intimate enough to make my stomach turn. "I can't stop thinking about today. I hate lying to him, but it's worth it for us. You make me feel alive in a way he never does." I put the phone down, my hands trembling. My mind raced with questions, but one thought rose above the rest. They were betraying me. The next morning, I couldn't look at Anna the same way. She hummed to herself in the kitchen, flipping pancakes like it was just another sunny Saturday morning. Meanwhile, I sat at the dining table, forcing a smile as she placed a plate in front of me. Every bite tasted like ashes. Scott came over later that day, as he often did on weekends. He walked in with his usual carefree demeanor, flashing me that boyish grin I used to admire. Now, it just made my blood boil. Anna greeted him a little too enthusiastically, her eyes lighting up in a way they never did for me anymore. I watched them closely, noting the small details I'd ignored before. The way she touched his arm when she laughed. The way his gaze lingered on her a moment too long. The way they seemed to share a secret language, one that didn't include me. When Anna disappeared upstairs to grab her phone, I seized the opportunity. "How have you been, Scott?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Not bad," he said, shrugging. "Anna's been a huge help. She's got a good heart, you know." "Yeah," I replied, staring hard at him. "She really does. Almost too good sometimes." He shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, laughing nervously. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just that you two seem pretty close these days," I said, my voice cool. "I guess I should be grateful she cares so much about family." His face flushed, and he quickly changed the subject, mumbling something about a new job prospect. I let it slide, but my suspicion was growing like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. I checked Anna's phone whenever I had the chance, though she was getting better at hiding things. She'd delete her messages with Scott almost immediately, but not before I caught enough snippets to confirm my worst fears. I can't wait to see you again. I don't know how much longer we can keep this a secret. Each message felt like a dagger to the chest. My wife, was sneaking around with my own brother. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. But I wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. I needed more than just vague texts. I needed proof, so undeniable, they couldn't weasel their way out of it. I started coming home earlier from work, claiming I wanted to spend more time with Anna. She didn't seem thrilled, which only made me more suspicious. One evening, I told her I had a late meeting, but instead of heading to the office, I parked down the street and waited. Sure enough, within 20 minutes, Scott's car pulled into the driveway. Through the living room window, I watched as they embraced, her hands resting on his chest, his lips brushing her temple. It took every ounce of restraint not to barge in and knock him out right then and there. But I held back. I needed to think, to plan. By the time Scott left that night, I had made up my mind. If they wanted to destroy my life, I'd make sure they paid for it. Every last bit of it. The morning after I saw Scott and Anna together, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. Rage still simmered beneath the surface, but I knew it wouldn't help me now. I needed to stay calm, to outthink them. They'd already underestimated me, and I planned to use that to my advantage. Anna was unusually chipper, humming to herself as she got ready for the day. She kissed my cheek on her way out the door, like nothing was amiss. The audacity of it nearly made me laugh. "I'll be home late tonight," she said breezily. "Nicole's having a rough time again, so I'm going to keep her company." "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Give her my best." As soon as she left, I called in sick to work. I didn't have time for spreadsheets and meetings. I had a marriage to dismantle. My first stop was a small electronics store a few towns over. I didn't want to risk being recognized. The clerk didn't ask questions when I purchased a set of mini cameras, a voice recorder, and a GPS tracker. By the time I left, my mind was buzzing with possibilities. Back home, I carefully installed the cameras in key spots. One in the living room near the couch where Anna and Scott always sat, another in the kitchen, and one more in the bedroom. I felt a pang of guilt as I placed the last one, but it quickly evaporated. She had forfeited any right to privacy the moment she brought my brother into our home. Next, I slipped the GPS tracker into the lining of her purse. It was small and discreet, virtually undetectable unless you were looking for it. As I worked, I pictured her face when she realized I'd caught her. I wondered if she'd cry, or if she'd double down on her lies. Either way, I'd be ready. That evening, I pretended to head out for drinks with a coworker, but in reality, I parked a few blocks away and watched the GPS tracker. Sure enough, it didn't lead to Nicole's house. Instead, it pinged at a small hotel on the outskirts of town. My stomach churned as I stared at the blinking dot on the map. I didn't want to believe it, even though I already knew the truth. I drove to the hotel, my hands gripping the wheel, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I parked across the street, far enough to remain unnoticed, and waited. Less than 10 minutes later, Scott's beat-up sedan pulled into the lot. He got out, glanced around nervously, and headed inside. The sight of him made my blood boil, but I stayed put. I couldn't risk confronting them now, not without concrete evidence. Instead, I used the voice recorder to capture their entry and got photos of Scott walking into the building. When I got home that night, Anna was already in bed, feigning exhaustion. "Long night with Nicole?" I asked casually. "Yeah," she murmured, not even bothering to open her eyes. "She's really going through it. Good thing she has you," I replied, the bitterness creeping into my tone. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the rage start to shift into something colder, more calculating. They thought they were clever, but they didn't realize they were walking straight into my trap. The next few days were a blur of planning and surveillance. The mini cameras I'd installed were already proving their worth. Anna and Scott had no idea they were being watched, and their interactions only confirmed what I already knew. They were playing me for a fool. The living room footage was particularly damning. One evening, while I was supposedly working late, Scott came over. The way they moved together was sickeningly familiar, as if they were a couple and I was just some clueless bystander. They laughed together, their heads close as they shared whispered words. At one point, Anna leaned in and kissed him, soft, lingering, as if she'd forgotten she was married. I rewound the footage, watching it over and over, the anger building with each replay. But it wasn't just anger anymore. It was determination. They thought they could humiliate me, betray me in my own home, and get away with it. They were wrong. The GPS tracker provided even more damning evidence. Anna's errands frequently led her to Scott's apartment or the same cheap hotel. The timestamps lined up perfectly with her excuses. Helping Nicole, grocery shopping, yoga classes. She'd crafted her lies so carefully, but now they unraveled with every ping of that tracker. The breaking point came one night when I returned home early. I hadn't planned it. I was supposed to be out with a client, but the meeting wrapped up sooner than expected. As I walked up the driveway, I saw Scott's car parked at the curb. My heart pounded in my chest as I unlocked the front door, stepping inside as quietly as possible. The sound of muffled laughter drifted from the living room. I crept closer, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. There they were, sitting on the couch, completely at ease. Scott had his arm draped over her shoulder, and Anna was leaning into him, her fingers tracing patterns on his thigh. "Unbelievable," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. They both jumped, their faces snapping toward me in identical expressions of shock and panic. Anna scrambled to her feet, stammering incoherently, while Scott just sat there, frozen like a deer in headlights. "Brian," Anna said, her voice shaky. "You're home early." "I was just helping Scott through his depression," I interrupted, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what this is?" "It's not what it looks like," she blurted, her face flushing. "We were just talking." "Talking," I repeated, nodding slowly. "You've been doing a lot of talking lately. At his place, at the Horizon Suites. You're practically a motivational speaker." Scott stood up, his hands raised defensively. "Look, Brian, I can explain." "Shut up," I snapped, my gaze locking onto him. "You don't get to explain anything. You're my brother. I trusted you. And you?" I turned to Anna, my voice rising. "You're my wife. How could you?" Anna's expression shifted, the panic giving way to defiance. "Maybe if you paid more attention to me instead of your job, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." The words hit me like a slap, but instead of crumbling, I felt something inside me harden. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Good to know where we stand." Without another word, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I could hear Anna calling after me, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out of that house before I did something I'd regret. But as I drove aimlessly through the night, my mind began to clear. I realized I didn't regret finding out the truth. If anything, I was grateful. Their betrayal had set something in motion, and now I was free to act without hesitation. The game had changed. Now it was my turn to play. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my car parked outside a 24-hour diner, replaying the confrontation in my head. Anna's defiance, Scott's pathetic silence. They'd both made their choices. Now it was time for me to make mine. By sunrise, I had the beginnings of a plan. It wasn't enough to simply confront them or file for divorce. That would let them walk away, maybe even into each other's arms, and I wasn't about to let that happen. No, I needed to hit them where it hurt. And for Anna, that meant taking everything she valued. Anna had always been meticulous about her image. She played the perfect wife at social events, always knew what to say to charm people, and cared deeply about her reputation. But beneath that polished surface was a woman who loved control, and I was going to take it away from her. The first step was gathering more evidence. I needed airtight proof of her affair with Scott, not just for leverage during the divorce, but to execute the next phase of my plan. Over the next week, I became a ghost in my own home. Anna barely noticed my quiet demeanor. She was too busy sneaking around with Scott to care. The cameras and tracker continued to work flawlessly. I now had hours of footage of them together, laughing, kissing, touching. Each clip stung, but it also fueled my resolve. They thought they were untouchable, so smug in their little secret. That arrogance would be their undoing. One night, while Anna was visiting Nicole, yet again, I made my move. She had left her laptop on the kitchen counter, and I quickly logged in using her saved password. She wasn't as careful as she thought. It didn't take long to find incriminating emails, hotel confirmations, and even receipts for gifts she'd bought Scott, things she claimed were business expenses. I copied everything onto a flash drive. That wasn't all I found. Buried in her email inbox was something unexpected. A chain of messages between her and a client of mine, a wealthy businessman I'd introduced to her at a charity event months ago. The messages hinted at some shady dealings. Anna was siphoning money from his account under the guise of consulting fees. My heart raced as I pieced it together. She was stealing, and she'd used my connections to do it. I sat back, the realization settling over me. This was bigger than I thought. If I played my cards right, I wouldn't just expose her as a cheater. I could destroy her completely. I copied the emails and added them to my growing file of evidence. The next morning, I started laying the groundwork. I contacted my lawyer, laying out the affair and the financial discrepancies I'd uncovered. He listened carefully, his tone turning serious as I outlined my plan. "This isn't just a divorce case," he said. "If we can prove theft, she could face criminal charges." "Exactly," I replied, my voice cold. "Let's make it happen." As the days passed, I began planting seeds for the final stage of my revenge. I transferred funds between our accounts, setting up a trail that pointed directly to Anna. It wasn't hard. She'd already started the process with her shady dealings. I just added fuel to the fire. I even deposited some of the money into Scott's account, ensuring he wouldn't escape unscathed. By the time I was done, the stage was set. Anna had no idea she was walking into a trap, and Scott was too naive to see the storm coming. They thought they'd won, but I was about to show them what losing really looked like. Anna carried on as though nothing had happened. If she noticed the subtle changes in my behavior, the long silences, the late nights spent in the study, she didn't show it. She probably assumed I was too devastated to fight back, too broken to notice her continued betrayal. That suited me just fine. Scott, predictably, kept his distance. He wasn't coming around as often, probably at Anna's insistence. She was careful not to flaunt their affair now that she knew I suspected something. But she couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. The evidence I'd collected was enough to obliterate any defense she might try to muster. The final phase of my plan required precision. I needed Anna to believe she was still in control, even as I pulled the rug out from under her. One evening, while she was in the shower, I slipped in her purse and removed her key to the safe in our bedroom. She had always been secretive about it, insisting it was for personal documents. Inside, I found exactly what I expected: bank statements, receipts, and incriminating evidence of her financial schemes. She'd siphoned thousands from one of my clients, laundering the money through fake consulting invoices. Her arrogance was staggering. She hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks properly. I took photos of everything, carefully returning the documents to their original places. Then, I added a little something of my own, a stack of forged papers suggesting she'd been funneling money out of my business account, too. The paperwork was convincing, carefully crafted to point directly to her and Scott. I couldn't stop smiling as I locked the safe. When Anna eventually tried to defend herself, she'd be buried under an avalanche of evidence. The next step was putting Scott in the crosshairs. He might have been a pawn in Anna's game, but that didn't absolve him of responsibility. I knew he relied heavily on me for financial support, even borrowing money from time to time. I used that to my advantage, planting forged documents that tied him to Anna's schemes. Bank transfers, messages about splitting the money. It all painted a picture of a complicit co-conspirator. By the end of the week, everything was in place. The trap was set, and all I needed was the right moment to spring it. That moment came sooner than expected. One afternoon, Anna announced she'd be meeting Scott for lunch to talk about his future. She didn't even bother hiding it anymore, which only made my blood boil. As soon as she left, I made a call to a private investigator I'd hired weeks ago. I provided him with the address of their lunch spot and instructed him to gather photographic evidence. It wasn't enough to rely on the cameras at home or the GPS tracker. I wanted clear, undeniable proof of their affair. That evening, I received a text from the investigator. Attached were several photos of Anna and Scott at a secluded corner table in a fancy restaurant, their heads close as they spoke. One picture showed Scott's hand resting on Anna's thigh, her face lit with a smile that was anything but innocent. I stared at the photos for a long time, my anger cold and controlled. It wasn't just about catching them anymore. It was about making sure they paid for what they'd done. And by this time tomorrow, they would. The day had finally come. Every piece of evidence was in place, and all I needed was one final confrontation to tie it all together. I had waited for this moment, enduring weeks of lies and betrayal with a calm exterior while the storm brewed inside me. Now it was time to let that storm loose. That morning, Anna seemed oblivious, humming softly as she made coffee. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and I saw Scott's name flash across the screen. She quickly grabbed it, her eyes flicking to me before she responded with a coy smile. I smiled back, pretending not to notice. "Got any plans today?" I asked casually. "Just errands," she said, sipping her coffee. "Might stop by Nicole's later." "Of course," I replied, holding back a laugh. Nicole had become her go-to excuse, a flimsy cover for her real plans with Scott. She had no idea her lies were about to come crashing down. Later that day, when Anna left the house, I made my move. I called my lawyer and the private investigator, ensuring everything was ready. Then I contacted the client Anna had stolen from. He was livid when I told him the full story, especially after I provided the documentation of her theft. Together, we contacted law enforcement, filing an official report. With the police involved, things were about to escalate. I made sure to emphasize that the money Anna had funneled wasn't just stolen. It had been laundered through Scott's accounts as well. My brother wasn't just a cheater now. He was an accomplice. That evening, Anna returned home, her face flushed with happiness. She had no idea what was waiting for her. I was sitting in the living room, the stack of damning documents spread out on the coffee table. "Hey," she said, hesitating when she saw my expression. "Everything okay?" "Why don't you sit down, Anna?" I said, my voice calm but firm. Her smile faltered, but she sat, her eyes flicking to the papers. "What's this?" "This," I said, gesturing to the stack, "is everything. Your affair with Scott, your theft from my client, your fake consulting schemes. It's all here." Her face drained of color. "Brian, this isn't what it looks like." "Don't bother." I cut her off. "I've heard enough of your lies. The police have copies of these documents. By this time tomorrow, they'll have an arrest warrant for you." Her eyes widened, and she looked genuinely scared for the first time. "The police? You're calling the police on me?" "You didn't just cheat on me, Anna," I said, my voice rising. "You stole from me, from my business, from people who trusted me. Did you really think I'd let you get away with that?" She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I can explain." "You don't need to explain," I said coldly. "You're going to jail, Anna. And Scott? He's going down with you. You two deserve each other." Her fear quickly turned to anger. "You can't do this to me. You have no proof." I laughed, pulling out my phone. "You think I don't have proof? I have video footage, GPS logs, bank transfers, emails, everything. I've been watching you for weeks, Anna. You didn't just destroy our marriage. You made it easy for me to destroy you." She lunged for the documents, but I was quicker, pulling them out of reach. "Don't bother," I said. "It's over." Before she could respond, the sound of sirens echoed outside. I had time to call to the police perfectly. Anna's head whipped toward the window, panic flashing across her face. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I stood, looking down at her one last time. "I'm just finishing what you started." The knock at the door was loud and authoritative. Anna stared at me, tears streaming down her face. "Brian, please." But I didn't answer. I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped aside as the officers came in. "She's in the living room," I said, my voice steady. As they handcuffed her and read her rights, she screamed my name, her voice raw with desperation. But I felt nothing. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone who had betrayed me in every way imaginable. This was justice. As the officers let her out, I stood in the doorway, watching as the life she had so carefully crafted crumbled around her. The house was eerily quiet after the police left, taking Anna with them. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. But my plan wasn't over yet. There was still one loose end to tie up, Scott. He didn't know it yet, but his betrayal had cost him more than just my trust. The police would soon be knocking on his door as well. I had made sure his involvement in Anna's financial schemes was clear. He might not have stolen the money himself, but the trail I created pointed straight to him as a willing accomplice. That night I called him. He picked up on the second ring, his voice hesitant. "Brian?" "Scott," I said evenly. "We need to talk." Sure. What's up?" His nervousness was palpable. He had to know something was wrong. "Come over. Now." I hung up before he could reply. He showed up 30 minutes later, looking like a guilty schoolboy. As he stepped into the house, he glanced around, his eyes darting nervously. "Where's Anna?" "Gone," I said, crossing my arms. "She won't be back." He froze. "What do you mean?" I gestured for him to sit, but he stayed standing. "Anna's been arrested. Theft, fraud, you name it. And guess what, Scott? Your name came up too." His face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't do anything." "Didn't you?" I stepped closer, my voice low and menacing. "You think I don't know about the affair? About the money? About everything?" He stammered, his hands trembling. I didn't steal anything, Brian. That was all her." I smiled, cold and unrelenting. "And yet, your bank account tells a different story. Funny how all those deposits line up with Anna's scams. The police are going to love going through your financials." His eyes widened, panic setting in. "You framed me." I shrugged. "Framed? Or just exposed? Doesn't matter. What matters is that you betrayed me. You didn't just cheat with my wife, Scott. You destroyed any chance of me helping you again. You're on your own now." "Brian, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I'm your brother. You can't do this to me." "You stopped being my brother the moment you touched her," I said, my voice like ice. "I gave you everything, Scott. A roof over your head, money when you needed it, a second chance when no one else would. And this is how you repay me." Tears streamed down his face, but I felt no pity. He had made his bed, and now he would lie in it. As I stepped back, the sound of sirens filled the air again. Scott's head snapped toward the door, his face crumpling in terror. "No," he whispered. "Brian, please. Don't let them take me." I didn't answer. The knock came, sharp and authoritative just like before. I opened the door, motioning to the officers. "He's right here," I said, stepping aside. Scott tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The officers grabbed him, cuffing his hands as he screamed my name. "Brian, please. I'm sorry. Don't do this." I stood in the doorway, watching as they dragged him to the waiting car. For a moment, I felt a pang of regret. He was my brother, after all, but then I remembered the betrayal, the lies, the smugness he'd shown when he thought he was untouchable. That regret evaporated like smoke. As the police car drove away, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. It was over. Anna and Scott had both played their games, and now they were paying the price. The house felt different without Anna and Scott. It was quieter, emptier, but also freer. The weight of their betrayal, which had hung heavy over every corner, was finally gone. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. The news of their arrests spread quickly. Anna's social circle, once so carefully curated, turned on her in an instant. The women who used to fawn over her at charity events now whispered behind her back, their judgment merciless. As for Scott, he became the black sheep of the family overnight. Even my estranged relatives reached out to express their disbelief and support for me. I returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. My colleagues, who'd noticed my distracted demeanor during the past month, seemed relieved to see me back to my old self. I didn't explain much, just hinted at personal issues that had been resolved. They didn't pry, and I appreciated that. The fallout from Anna's schemes was swift and brutal. The client she'd stolen from wasn't content to let the law handle it. He filed a civil suit against her as well. She had no money to pay for a lawyer, no family willing to help, and no friends left to turn to. She was well and truly alone. Scott, meanwhile, tried to shift the blame entirely onto Anna, but it didn't work. The forged documents and bank records I'd planted painted a convincing picture of his involvement. His public defender was overwhelmed, and his case quickly spiraled. He'd lost everything, his freedom, his reputation, and most importantly, my trust. One evening, about a week after their arrests, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Anna, written in shaky handwriting on cheap prison stationery. Brian, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to hear me out. I made mistakes, terrible, unforgivable mistakes, but I never stopped loving you. Please don't let this be the end. If you can find it in your heart to visit me, I'll explain everything. I need to see you. Please. Anna, asterisk. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the trash. There was nothing left to say. Anna had burned every bridge, and I had no intention of letting her rebuild even a single one. Scott, on the other hand, didn't bother trying to reach out. Whether it was shame, fear, or stubbornness, I didn't care. His silence was the only gift he'd given me in months. As the days turned into weeks, I began to rebuild my life. I threw out the remnants of my marriage, photos, clothes, the gifts we'd exchanged over the years. Each item that left the house felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming my space. I even took a sledgehammer to the bed we'd shared, smashing it into pieces before hauling it to the curb. It was cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. No lies, no manipulation, no betrayal. Just me. The days after Anna and Scott were gone were surreal. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine again. No secrets lurking in the shadows, no suffocating tension. It was just me alone with my thoughts, and the quiet was comforting. I took a long, hard look at myself during those weeks. Betrayal changes you, and I knew I couldn't go back to the man I was before. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. I realized I had been too trusting, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. It was time to build something stronger, something that couldn't be shaken by lies and deceit. One of the first things I did was sell the house. There were too many memories embedded in those walls, memories I no longer wanted to revisit. I found a cozy apartment downtown, close to work and far enough from the life I was leaving behind. It was a fresh start, a blank slate to rebuild my life on my terms. I also reached out to a therapist, someone to help me process everything that had happened. At first, it felt strange to talk about my pain with a stranger, but over time, it became a lifeline. For years, I had been the rock for everyone else, Scott, Anna, even my parents, and I'd forgotten how to lean on someone when I needed it. Therapy reminded me that it was okay to feel vulnerable, as long as I didn't let it define me. Work became my sanctuary. Throwing myself into projects helped distract me from the lingering sting of betrayal. My colleagues noticed the change, even commented on how much sharper and more focused I seemed. In truth, I wasn't just working harder. I was working smarter, driven by a determination to prove to myself that I could thrive despite everything. One afternoon, I bumped into an old friend from college at a coffee shop. Her name was Rachel, and we hadn't spoken in years. We spent hours catching up, reminiscing about our wild college days and the paths our lives had taken since. She had been through her own rough patch, divorced and raising a daughter on her own, but there was a strength in her that I admired. We exchanged numbers, promising to keep in touch. Rachel and I began meeting for coffee regularly, and those meetings turned into dinners, then long walks through the city. She was easy to talk to, her laugh genuine and infectious. There was no pressure, no rush. It was just two people finding comfort in each other's company. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. As for Anna and Scott, their fates were sealed. Anna's trial ended with a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to several years in prison for fraud and theft. The court ordered restitution, though she had no means to pay it. Scott, too, was convicted as her accomplice. He received a lighter sentence due to his lesser role, but his reputation was ruined. He'd never work in any respectable field again, and the family had all but disowned him. I didn't feel triumphant, just relieved. They had made their choices, and now they were paying for them. I had no sympathy left for either of them. As I sat in my new apartment one evening, staring out at the city lights, I realized how far I'd come. The man who had been blindsided by betrayal was gone. In his place was someone stronger, wiser, and ready to move forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt free.